The robotics event for parents is upstairs. You've got the wrong floor.
Jonah Kincaid. I have a 9 o'clock with your team, Kobe, Juniper Gate Capital.
I'm sure you do. Security handles misdirected guests.
Miss Rurel Khanna, you might want to verify who you're speaking to.
And you must be leading this deal.
Welcome. I'm just the analyst. Mr. Kincaid is the one you want. You may want to check the calendar before you make that call.
Get him out.
Daphne Rawal made her decision in under 2 minutes. No calendar check, no name verification, just one look at a man carrying a child's backpack and a quiet order to security. He didn't argue. He walked out, took out his phone, and made one call. The backpack belonged to his 10-year-old daughter. The 9 o'clock appointment she had just rejected belonged to him. In a lobby full of people who read power through tailored suits and firm handshakes, nobody stopped to ask the only question that mattered: who exactly had Daphne Rawal just thrown out? If you've ever been judged before, you had a chance to speak, this story is going to hit differently. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because the moment Daphne finds out who she just walked away from, everything changes. The Halcyon Wharf Hotel had been running 2 entirely different events since 7 in the morning, and the lobby reflected that confusion in the most visible way possible. On one side, hotel staff in pressed uniforms were arranging directional signs toward the ballroom, the Heliospan Integration Forum, annual gathering of the company's largest clients and most closely watched investors. On the other side, children in matching team shirts were flooding the elevator banks with foam board prototypes and half-assembled circuit boards, heading up to the 3rd floor, where the regional youth robotics competition had taken over 4 conference rooms. The staff had taped extra signage to the pillars, but it didn't seem to be helping. Families kept drifting toward the ballroom entrance, executives kept stepping around, rolling luggage carts, and the woman at the concierge desk had been redirecting people since 8 o'clock. Jonah Kincaid had navigated through the 3rd floor corridor twice before finding the correct check-in table for the robotics event. His daughter Sylvie was already scanning the room when they arrived, 10 years old, and moving with the particular focus of someone who had been thinking about this day for 3 weeks. She had built a small autonomous sorting machine using components salvaged from a broken printer and 2 motors she'd ordered with her birthday money, and she had not stopped adjusting the calibration since Tuesday. Jonah helped her carry the prototype to the team staging area and stayed long enough to make sure she was settled before she turned around and pressed her small backpack into his hands, asking him to hold it while she worked. He looked at the backpack, then at his phone. 7 minutes until his 9 o'clock meeting in the lobby. He told Sylvie he would return the bag after the meeting and headed back toward the elevator. He stepped out onto the main floor in a light blue button-down dark trousers and the leather briefcase he had carried since the early years of Juniper Gate Capital, when the fund had 3 employees and operated out of a rented office in Cambridge. He had not changed his appearance for the meeting, not because he was careless about it, but because it had simply not occurred to him that he needed to. Juniper Gate's team had spent 8 months reviewing Heliospan's financials, interviewing former employees, and analyzing the company's internal HR data. Jonah had reviewed every document personally. He knew what he was walking into. What he had not accounted for was what the lobby would look like to someone who had not read those files. Nadia Serrano was standing near the far end of the lobby corridor when Jonah crossed toward the main conference area. She had a phone pressed between her ear and shoulder and was typing rapidly on a tablet, with both hands relaying instructions to a technical team somewhere off-site about a platform access issue that had surfaced 40 minutes before the first panel of the day. She was the one who had flagged the error at 6:30 that morning. She was the one who had already drafted the workaround. She would not be listed as a speaker at any of the day's sessions, though the sessions themselves would have been significantly harder to run without the infrastructure she had quietly maintained for the past 3 years. Jonah recognized her face from the personnel files his team had assembled. He had spent considerable time on her folder, specifically on the performance reviews and the promotion recommendations that went nowhere, and the notes that appeared with quiet regularity in her evaluations. He looked at her for a moment while she worked, then continued toward the ballroom entrance. The financial picture inside Heliospan was not complicated to understand, even if it was painful to look at directly. The company had made a large acquisition 3 years earlier, purchasing a data analytics firm before that firm's core product was ready for market. The integration had cost more than projected and delivered less than promised. Customers had started leaving. Several product timelines had slipped by more than a year, and the company was spending more every month than it was bringing in. Russell Dane, the CFO, had managed to keep the company functional through a combination of bridge financing and deferred payments, but he had also made very clear to anyone in a position to listen that the options were running out. Earlier that morning, while Daphne was positioning herself near the VIP elevator bank, Russell had found Kira Solano in the hallway outside the executive suite and told her the Juniper Gate meeting needed to go smoothly. His exact words were that Heliospan did not have a second chance at this, and he said them without drama because he did not need drama. The numbers made the point for him. Kira had been Daphne's executive assistant for 4 years. She had watched Daphne prepare for dozens of high-stakes meetings, the research beforehand, the controlled presentation of confidence, the way she read a room within 60 seconds of entering it. What Kira had also learned more quietly and over a longer period was when Daphne was reading a room accurately, and when she was reading the version of it she expected to find. That distinction had started to matter more in the past year, in ways Kira had not yet found a way to name or address. Daphne saw Jonah from across the lobby before he reached her. She registered the backpack, first small canvas, printed with an astronaut illustration. She had watched families with that exact kind of luggage moving through the lobby all morning on their way to the 3rd floor. She registered the briefcase second, and the unremarkable clothing. She did not open the meeting calendar on her phone, which she had not checked since the previous evening. By the time Jonah had crossed half the lobby, she had already placed him in a category, and the category was not investor. He introduced himself fully. He named the fund, referenced the investment proposal, and extended his hand. Daphne pointed him toward the signage for the robotics event without taking the hand he offered. When he clarified that he had a confirmed appointment with her team regarding the capital package, she told him the hotel staff could help him find the correct floor. He opened his email and held up the screen showing the meeting confirmation. She did not look at it. What happened next is visible in the footage, several people captured on their phones, though none of them understood at the time what they were watching. Evan Rudd walked into the lobby from the street entrance carrying a tablet and wearing a well-fitted suit with a lanyard from a co-investment fund visible around his neck. He was there to observe the meeting as a note-taker for his firm's senior partners and had no decision-making authority over any part of the deal. Daphne walked past Jonah and extended her hand to Evan with the practiced ease of someone who had finally found the person they were looking for. When Evan told her he was just the analyst and gestured back toward Jonah, something shifted in Daphne's expression, not into uncertainty, but into something harder. She had made a public assessment. Correcting it publicly was a different kind of problem than she wanted to handle in the next 60 seconds. Kira's voice came through Daphne's earpiece to say that Jonah Kincaid had arrived and was in the lobby. Daphne glanced at Jonah and replied that she had already found him, then ended the connection before Kira could say anything else. Jonah told her she might want to verify the appointment before making a formal decision. He said it without sharpness, without the edge of someone who felt wronged, which perhaps was part of why it didn't register as a warning. Daphne had already turned toward Martin Cole, the hotel's head of security, and was telling him that a man had been attempting to access the VIP conference area under a false claim and needed to be escorted out. Martin had worked hotel security for 11 years. He had a particular ability to assess situations without projecting the assessment onto his face, and what he was assessing right now was that the man being described as a problem was standing quietly with his hands at his sides and had not raised his voice once. He walked alongside Jonah toward the front entrance anyway, because the event contract specified that the hotel security team operated at the direction of the organizing client, and Heliospan was the organizing client. Jonah told Martin before they reached the doors that he didn't hold him responsible for someone else's call. Martin said he appreciated that. They parted outside on the sidewalk with the particular cordiality of two people who both understood what had just happened and who was responsible for it. Outside, Jonah took out his phone and called Juniper Gates' general counsel. He gave 5 instructions in the span of about 90 seconds: suspend all due diligence activity on Heliospan immediately, place the $350 million capital package on hold, notify both co-investment partners that Juniper Gate could not move forward at this time, preserve every document in the Heliospan file without alteration, and issue no public statement about the status of the deal. He did not tell his counsel he was angry because he was not angry in any simple sense. What he had just watched was not a rushed judgment in a crowded lobby. It was a demonstration of exactly the pattern his team had been documenting for 8 months: the assumption that visible family responsibility and institutional power could not occupy the same person at the same time. He had come to the meeting partly to test that assumption. Daphne had answered the question before he finished a sentence. Inside the hotel, Daphne returned to the conference area and told Kira to remove the Juniper Gate meeting from the official schedule and notify hotel management that an unverified individual had attempted to access a restricted event. Martin filed his own incident report with the hotel's documentation system, noting clearly that the individual in question had provided his name, shown a confirmation email, made no threats, and cooperated fully with the escort. When Daphne's team requested that the language in that report be revised to reflect that the individual had refused to cooperate with event staff, Martin left his original language in place and submitted a second document recording the revision request itself. Kira read both documents. She had spent 4 years learning which of Daphne's decisions were made from strength and which were made from the need to avoid being seen as wrong, and she recognized immediately which kind this was. She opened a secure folder on her personal device and copied into it the meeting confirmation, the earpiece communication log from that morning, the original incident report, and the revision request. She did not yet know exactly how or when she would use these files. What she did know was that when someone asks you to change what happened, the first obligation is to protect the record of what actually happened, and that if the moment came when that record mattered, she intended to have it. Evan Rudd found Daphne in the corridor outside the main ballroom 20 minutes later and told her plainly that Jonah Kincaid was not a parent who had wandered onto the wrong floor. He was the founder of Juniper Gate Capital and the sole person at the fund with authority to approve the $350 million investment. Daphne absorbed this, then asked Evan to give her a few minutes. Kira placed the deal file on the table, the printed profile with a photo, a biographical summary, and a signature. Daphne recognized from the term sheet her team had reviewed 4 weeks earlier. The face in the photograph was the same face she had pointed toward the robotics sign 40 minutes ago. Russell appeared in the doorway and told her in the flat tone of someone delivering news they had hoped not to deliver that Juniper Gate had suspended its involvement and that both co-investors had been notified. Without Juniper Gate leading the deal, neither partner would proceed independently. He listed the three remaining options: asset liquidation, mass layoffs, or bankruptcy filing, and said the timeline on all three was shorter than anyone wanted it to be. Daphne drafted an email to Jonah that afternoon expressing regret for failing to recognize him as an authorized representative of the fund. She focused the message on his title and the value of the capital package. She did not address why she had declined to look at his confirmation email, or why her first move after the lobby had been to request an alteration to a security report. Jonah read the email and did not respond. The video had been filmed on someone's phone from a position near the lobby's second pillar at an angle that captured both the entrance and the VIP corridor. It was 43 seconds long. In those 43 seconds, a viewer could see Jonah holding up his phone screen toward a woman who did not look at it, the same woman turning toward a younger man who had just walked in and extending her hand before that man had spoken a word, and then a brief exchange that ended with a security officer walking Jonah toward the front doors. The video did not have audio clear enough to make out every word, but it did not need to. The sequence of events was legible on its own. By the time it began circulating that afternoon, Heliospan's communications team was already fielding calls from two financial journalists who had independently received the clip. By evening, three of Heliospan's largest banking partners had sent formal inquiries requesting an updated statement on the status of the company's capital position. Two clients with contracts up for renewal that quarter notified their account managers that they were postponing renewal conversations pending further clarity. A vendor that had been operating on extended payment terms sent a legal letter requesting immediate settlement of outstanding invoices, citing concern about the company's solvency. The morning had produced a single bad decision in a hotel lobby. By nightfall, that decision had acquired consequences that could not be recalled. Daphne addressed the board in an emergency session held via video conference the following morning. She described the incident as a breakdown in event coordination. Two simultaneous events in the same hotel, an unfamiliar face, a moment of misidentification that had been resolved as quickly as it arose. The board members who had already watched the video did not ask many follow-up questions, which was not a sign that they were satisfied. The night before that board meeting, Kira had made her decision. She had spent the previous evening reviewing everything she had saved: the earpiece log, the original incident report, the revision request, the meeting confirmation, and she understood that if she said nothing, the version of events Daphne was constructing would become the permanent record. That was not a version she was willing to be part of. She contacted the board's governance chair directly and provided copies of everything in her folder before the meeting began. She did not frame it as an act of disloyalty. She framed it to herself as the only thing that made sense to do with a record she had taken the trouble to preserve. When one board member asked Daphne directly whether she had been informed via her earpiece that Jonah Kincaid was in the lobby before she made her decision, Daphne said she believed there may have been a communication delay. The chair pulled up Kira's documentation without comment and shared it on the screen. The timestamp on the earpiece log showed the notification had been delivered 40 seconds before Daphne requested security. Daphne did not revise her answer. She simply stopped elaborating on it. Martin Cole submitted a written account to the board consistent with the report he had originally filed. Evan Rudd provided a brief statement confirming that Daphne had initiated a handshake with him before asking his name, and that she had appeared to treat him as the senior representative of Juniper Gate on the basis of his appearance alone. Neither Martin nor Evan editorialized. They simply described what they had observed, which was enough. The board voted to bring in an outside investigator. Marisol Venn was a corporate governance specialist who had conducted similar reviews for 3 other companies in the preceding 2 years, 2 of which had involved systemic HR concerns that leadership had failed to self-identify. She was given full access to personnel records, promotion histories, internal communications, and the HR evaluation database going back 5 years. Daphne was formally restricted from accessing those systems for the duration of the review. For the first time in 11 years of running Heliospan, she could not determine what information was being gathered about her or her decisions. It was Nadia Serrano who presented the personnel data to the board 2 days later. She had not been asked to compile it. She had been compiling it quietly for over a year in a format that could be shared clearly with people who had not lived inside it the way she had. The central mechanism she described was a scoring category embedded in Heliospan's internal review system called the Leadership Readiness Index. It measured things like responsiveness outside business hours, participation in unscheduled travel and availability for evening meetings, and it contributed meaningfully to promotion decisions despite never appearing in any official job description or offer letter. Nadia walked through the numbers without rhetorical flourish. Employees, without caregiving responsibilities, scored consistently higher on the index, regardless of their actual performance outcomes. Employees who were primary caregivers to children, aging parents, or family members with disabilities scored lower on average and were promoted at a slower rate, even when their performance reviews were strong and their direct managers rated them positively. A board member asked for a specific example. Nadia pulled up her own file without announcing what it was. The notes stretched back 3 years' phrases about her being unlikely to commit fully to cycles requiring sacrifice, about potential distraction from personal obligations, about not being positioned for roles, demanding total availability. The most recent note had been added 4 months ago after she had requested a schedule adjustment to accompany her mother to a medical consultation. The adjustment had been approved. The note had been added anyway. 37 personnel records contained similar language. The board did not need Marisol to explain the legal implications. What they understood in that room beyond the legal exposure was that the organization Daphne had built had been systematically undervaluing a substantial portion of its workforce for reasons that had nothing to do with the work those people were doing. The $350 million crisis had arrived because of one morning in a hotel lobby. But the conditions that made that morning possible had been accumulating for years. Daphne flew to Boston 3 days later. She went alone, no communications advisor, no legal team, no prepared presentation. Juniper Gates' offices were in a converted brick building near the waterfront, functional rather than designed to impress, and the receptionist directed her to a waiting area on the 2nd floor without ceremony. She waited for nearly 4 hours, and she did not have her phone out the entire time. She watched the office instead. A senior director wrapped up a call, glanced at the clock, said he needed to leave to get his kids, and walked out while 2 colleagues continued the conversation without remarking on his exit. A woman at a standing desk was working through a complex financial model while periodically texting someone. She mentioned once that her father's rehab session had run long and she was catching up, and the person nearest to her said that made sense and offered to cover the afternoon check-in call. A man from the facilities team came through to replace a water filter and was greeted by name by 2 people who passed him in the hallway. Nobody looked at their watch when he came in. Nobody adjusted their posture. Daphne had run a company for 11 years, and she recognized organizational culture when she saw it. She was also, for the first time in a long time, sitting still enough to recognize what had been missing from her own. Jonah received her in a small conference room with a round table and no presentation equipment. He sat across from her and waited. Daphne told him she owed him an apology for failing to recognize him as an authorized representative of Juniper Gate Capital. Jonah listened to the full sentence and then told her that what she had just described was not an apology for what had actually happened. She had apologized for failing to identify a powerful person. She had not addressed the belief underneath that failure, the belief that a man who appeared to be managing family obligations in a visible way could not simultaneously be managing serious financial decisions. He asked her 3 questions without waiting for answers between them. If he had simply been a father looking for the right floor, would she have flown to Boston? If the deal had been worth $3,000 instead of $350 million, would she remember his face? If no one had filmed the lobby, would the revised security report have become the official record? Of that morning, Daphne sat with those questions. She did not reach for language to explain them away, which was notable because explaining things away had been a practiced skill for a very long time. She told him she had seen the backpack, the unremarkable clothes, the general appearance of someone dividing their attention between a meeting and a child's schedule, and had concluded before he finished his introduction that he was not in the correct part of the building. She said it plainly without softening it. Jonah told her his concern had never been about whether she knew who he was. He had needed her to check before using institutional authority to remove a person from a space. She had not done that. What she had done instead was use the resources available to her: a security officer, an event contract, a position of organizational power, to make her initial judgment stick without testing it. And when the judgment turned out to be wrong, her first response had been to alter the documentation rather than correct the record. Daphne asked him to restore the deal. She told him that 2,600 people worked at Heliospan, that most of them had had nothing to do with what happened in that lobby, and that the consequences of Juniper Gate walking away would fall on them. Jonah said he understood that and was willing to consider a path forward for the company. He was not willing to construct that path in a way that protected her position within it. He outlined the terms. The $350 million would be released in stages, with each stage contingent on verifiable progress against specific conditions. The first tranche would cover payroll core client operations and outstanding payments to small vendors. Nothing beyond that. No performance bonuses for senior leadership, no stock repurchases, no special severance arrangements for Daphne, and no use of company funds to cover legal costs generated by the investigation into her own conduct. The remaining capital would follow only when Heliospan demonstrated measurable change, not announced it. Daphne would resign the CEO role within 6 weeks and would have no involvement, formal or informal, in selecting her successor. Marisol's investigation would have unrestricted access to 5 years of HR records, and every condition her report recommended would be implemented without filtering. The Leadership Readiness Index would be suspended immediately, and any evaluation criterion tied to after-hours availability would require documented role-specific justification before it could be used in any personnel decision. Every employee whose record contained caregiving-related negative notations would have the right to request a file review, submit a formal appeal, and receive compensation if the investigation found that those notations had cost them income or advancement. Kira Nadia Martin and any other individual who had provided documentation or testimony during the review would be formally protected from retaliation by a separate clause in the investment agreement. The board would add at least 2 members with demonstrated backgrounds in organizational culture and caregiver rights before the end of the calendar year. The final condition was the one Daphne sat with longest. She would be required to address Heliospan's full workforce in person and describe exactly what had happened at the Halcyon Wharf Hotel. The words misunderstanding, miscommunication, and procedural error were excluded from the statement. She would need to confirm that Jonah had provided identification, and she had declined to examine it, that she had welcomed a stranger based on appearance alone, that she had directed security to remove someone using authority that belonged to her position, rather than to any legitimate concern, that she had subsequently attempted to alter the record of those events, and that what she had done in that lobby was not an isolated lapse, but a visible expression of assumptions that had been shaping decisions inside Heliospan for years. Daphne signed the agreement before she left the building. It was not a decision she experienced as anything other than what it was, the end of the version of herself she had been building since she took the CEO role 11 years ago. The woman who had believed that controlling who entered a room, who was recognized in it, who was allowed to stay, was the same thing as leadership. She had protected that belief with considerable skill for a long time. She had in the end protected it all the way to the edge of the thing she had built, and then one step over. The communications team delivered the first draft of Daphne's statement to her office the morning after she returned from Boston. It was 4 paragraphs long and used the phrase, "a meeting that did not proceed as intended," in the opening sentence. The second paragraph described the hotel lobby as an environment with competing logistical demands that created conditions for miscommunication. The third expressed regret for any disruption to investor relationships. The fourth announced a renewed commitment to inclusive leadership practices going forward. It was a professionally constructed document built to acknowledge the minimum required while protecting as much of the existing narrative as possible. Daphne read it twice, then set it face down on her desk. Kira was standing near the window when Daphne looked up and asked her to find the line in the draft that acknowledged she had welcomed Evan Rudd without asking his name. Kira read through all 4 paragraphs slowly and told her there wasn't one. Daphne asked her to find the line that acknowledged she had held up a confirmation email and declined to look at it. Kira said that wasn't in there either. Daphne picked up the document, walked it to the recycling bin beside the door, and dropped it in. She sat back down at her desk, opened a blank document on her own screen, and wrote the statement herself. She did not ask anyone to review it before the all-staff meeting. The meeting was held in the main auditorium at Heliospan's Providence office, with all remaining locations joining by video. 2,600 employees either in the room or on a screen. There was no pre-show, no highlight reel of company milestones, no music playing when people filed in. Daphne walked to the podium alone with the statement she had written printed on a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the podium, but did not look at it much after the first 30 seconds. She told them what had happened. Not a version of it shaped for the least damage. Not a framing designed to leave her judgment partially intact. Jonah Kincaid had arrived at the Halcyon Wharf Hotel with a confirmed appointment. He had provided his name. He had shown her the confirmation on his phone. She had not looked at it. She had looked at the backpack he was carrying for his daughter, at his clothes, at the overall impression of a man whose attention appeared to be divided between professional and personal obligations, and she had concluded before he finished a sentence that he did not belong in that part of the building. Minutes later, a younger man in a suit had walked in, and she had approached him first, offered her hand first, and assumed without any verification that he was the person she was looking for. Evan Rudd had not told her his name. She had not asked. She had read his appearance and made a decision, the same way she had read Jonah's appearance and made a different one. The room was very quiet. Daphne continued. After the incident became public, she said her first response had not been to correct the record. It had been to ask the hotel's security team to revise their incident report so that it described Jonah as uncooperative, which he had not been. Martin Cole had declined to alter his original account, and Kira Solano had preserved copies of both the original report and the request to change it. Daphne told the room she was grateful for that, because it meant there was a record of what she had actually done, rather than only the version she had tried to substitute for it. A man seated in the middle section raised his hand and asked whether she would have called this meeting if Jonah Kincaid had simply been a parent who needed directions to the third floor, someone with no deal, no fund, no leverage over the company's survival. Daphne told him she probably would not have. She said that was the part she found hardest to say out loud, because it meant that Jonah's basic dignity in that lobby had not been what motivated her to correct anything. His financial position had made the consequences of her behavior unavoidable, and unavoidable consequences had made her act. That was not the same as believing he deserved to be heard before she decided to remove him, and she was not going to stand at a podium and pretend otherwise. A woman near the back stood without raising her hand and asked whether an apology returned the promotions that hadn't happened, the pay grades that hadn't changed, the years spent proving that having a family did not make someone less serious about their work. Daphne said no. She said she understood that an acknowledgement of what had gone wrong was not the same as repairing what the wrong had cost, and she was not there to ask anyone to treat those two things as equivalent. She announced the terms she had agreed to in Boston. Her resignation as CEO would take effect within 6 weeks. She would have no role, formal or otherwise, in determining who came next. She was forfeiting her remaining performance bonuses and would not seek severance arrangements beyond what was standard for all departing employees at her level. Marisol Ven's investigation would proceed with full access, and its findings would be made available to the entire workforce without filtering. Any employee whose record contained notations about caregiving obligations affecting their suitability for advancement had the right to request a formal review and to appeal any decisions they believed had been influenced by those notations. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not say she hoped people would come to understand her better over time. She thanked them for their time and stepped back from the podium. No one applauded. The room held the kind of silence that is not an absence of response, but its own form of response, people absorbing something they had waited a long time to hear and were not yet sure what to do with now that they had heard it. The board appointed Nadia Serrano as interim CEO effective the following week. On her first day, Nadia suspended the Leadership Readiness Index across all divisions and sent a company-wide message stating that any evaluation criterion tied to after-hours availability or schedule flexibility would require documented justification specific to the role before it could be used in any personnel decision. She did not frame it as a new initiative or a cultural transformation program. She framed it as a correction because that was what it was. Marisol's team worked through the personnel files over the following 3 months. 37 records had been flagged initially, the full review surfaced more. In cases where the documentation clearly showed that caregiving-related notations had influenced promotion decisions disconnected from performance. Outcomes affected employees were offered file corrections, title adjustments, or compensation packages calibrated to the estimated impact on their earnings trajectory. Not everyone accepted. Some filed separate legal claims. Marisol's report noted all of it without minimizing it, and the board made the full report available as Daphne had committed. Juniper Gate released capital in tranches as Heliospan met its benchmarks. The first release covered payroll through the end of the fiscal year and cleared the outstanding vendor debts that had been generating legal pressure. Subsequent releases followed reviews of actual data, how many file appeals had been processed, how many resulted in reversals, whether any documented retaliation had occurred against people who had provided testimony, and how the promotion rates for employees with caregiving responsibilities compared to the previous year's numbers. When a mid-year review showed that one division had reinstated an informal after-hours responsiveness expectation through a manager's verbal instructions rather than written policy. Juniper Gate sent a formal note and withheld the next tranche until the situation was corrected and documented. The process was not warm. It was designed to be accurate. Heliospan did not emerge from the restructuring intact in every way. Several projects were wound down, 2 office leases were not renewed, and a product line that had been absorbing resources without generating returns was discontinued. But the layoffs that Russell had been preparing contingency plans for did not happen. The client relationships that had stalled came back to the table once the capital position stabilized. After 9 months, the board converted Nadia's interim appointment to a permanent one. She accepted with the same directness she had brought to everything else, no ceremony, no speech about her journey. She had work to do, and she went back to doing it. Daphne attended a series of structured listening sessions during the months following her resignation, facilitated by an organizational consultant retained by the board as part of the governance reform. The sessions were not therapy, and they were not mediation. They were conversations in which former colleagues and employees described the impact of specific decisions and specific systems on their careers and their lives inside Heliospan, and Daphne's role was to listen, not to respond or explain. Several times in the early sessions, she began sentences with constructions like, "I want to be clear that I never intended," or "I think it's important to understand the context." The facilitator redirected her each time with a consistent observation that the absence of deliberate intent does not reduce the weight of impact, and that explaining the context of a decision is a different activity from understanding what the decision cost the people who lived with it. Over time, Daphne stopped reaching for those sentences. It was not a comfortable adjustment. It was by a considerable margin the most difficult work she had undertaken in her career because it required her to hold the full weight of what she had done without the counterbalance of being told she was still fundamentally a good person. She stopped needing that counterbalance eventually. She stopped expecting the room to offer it. 13 months after the morning at the Halcyon Wharf Hotel, the Heliospan Integration Forum returned to the same venue. The logistics were handled by Kira, who managed the full event schedule from a role that had been officially expanded to reflect the scope of work she had always been doing. Martin Cole had designed the new guest verification protocol himself, and his team had been briefed on it thoroughly. Credentials were confirmed before anyone was redirected, and the standard applied uniformly regardless of what a person was wearing or carrying. Jonah arrived with Sylvie, who had just finished presenting at a regional robotics showcase held at a different location that morning. He was wearing the same style of clothes he always wore. Sylvie had her backpack on the same one with the astronaut print slightly more worn than it had been a year ago. The front desk associate who checked them in was someone who had started at the hotel 4 months earlier. She looked up when they approached, asked for the name found on the list, and gave Jonah the event credentials with a brief professional greeting. She did not look at the backpack. She did not recalibrate her manner when the name came up on her screen, with a notation about the Juniper Gate partnership. The interaction was the same at the beginning as it was at the end. Daphne was there as a board guest, not as an executive. She crossed the lobby when she saw Jonah near the entrance and extended her hand. He looked at her for a moment, carrying the weight of a lobby that had looked very similar a year before, and a hand that had not been taken, and then he shook it. The handshake was not a resolution. It was not a signal that what had happened had been sufficiently addressed, or that the distance between what she had done and what it had cost people had been fully closed. It was a handshake between two people who were both still present in a building where something significant had changed, and who both understood that the change was real only insofar as it continued. Daphne told him the worst thing she had done was not the failure to recognize a fund manager. The worst thing was that she had believed for years that a man whose responsibilities as a father were visible to the room was therefore less serious about everything else, and that a person needed to establish their value before they were owed basic attention. Jonah nodded and didn't add to it. A few minutes later, an engineer came through the main entrance in clothes that had streaks of what looked like acrylic paint on the sleeve, carrying a science fair display board under one arm. He apologized to the front desk associate for running late, explaining he had come directly from his son's school event. She checked his name, handed him his badge, and pointed him toward the conference wing. She did not look at the paint on his sleeve. She did not adjust her expression when he mentioned the school. She moved to the next person in line. Jonah saw it from across the lobby, and a slow smile crossed his face. Not the satisfaction of a lesson delivered, but the quieter recognition of something that had actually taken hold. Heliospan had not proven it had changed by treating the man who carried $350 million with more care. It had proven it by treating the next person who walked through the door exactly the same way before anyone had a reason to. There's something worth sitting with before you close this out. The people who get overlooked most often are not the ones who lack ability. They are the ones who are visible in the wrong ways, carrying a child's bag, leaving on time, saying no to a 9 o'clock meeting because someone at home needs them. That visibility gets read as a warning sign, when more often than not, it is a sign of someone managing more than most people see. If a story like this one makes you think differently about how you read a room or how you've been read in one, then it's done its job. Subscribe if you want more stories about the moments that actually change things. We put one out every week, and we'll see you in the next one.